Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to the breakout session on VMware Tools today. It's great to see a full house. Lots of interest in the topic, apparently. My name is Eric Gray, and I do technical marketing for vSphere, and part of that is the lifecycle management of VMware Tools on vSphere. I've been at VMware for about 12 years, and really enjoy working for this company. And thank you so much for coming to VMworld this year in Europe. One of the things I get to do in my job a lot is to talk to customers, and they often tell me about the questions and the challenges they're having with VMware Tools. And so that's what this session is really about, is just to break it down and give you an overview of the kind of things I typically see our customers asking. Okay, you might want to follow me on Twitter. I normally tweet about VMware-related topics and not too many pictures of my kids playing soccer, but you know, they might slip in there once in a while. Standard disclaimer, you've probably seen it a few times. I'll mention a couple things during this session that are not part of a currently shipping product, so this disclaimer would apply to those tech preview items. Just a couple minor things for this session. Just to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about, we're going to start out with an overview of the three different kinds of VMware tools and why there are three different kinds of VMware tools. We'll spend some time about the status display in vSphere. That can be a little bit confusing for some folks. And then some lifecycle issues and supportability for some of the older tools that you might want to be aware of. And then a standardization approach. You know, it seems like you can't turn around in vSphere without seeing this message pop up that VMware Tools is out of date. So let's look at a couple different approaches you can use to standardize tools throughout your entire environment so that you can upgrade when you're ready and not just whenever they sneak in. And then finally, we'll go through all the different methods that you have at your disposal to update tools in your environment. We have quite a few, which seems confusing, but it's for a reason. You can pick the ones you like. All right, so let's jump right in. Back in the beginning, when there was VMware Workstation, you know, we had VMware Tools delivered on an ISO image. Everybody's familiar with this. There's one for every supported guest operating system. You mount it to your virtual machine, you run the installation routine, and that's pretty straightforward. So those are sometimes we call those the ISO tools, or in the case of Linux tools that are delivered in this form factor, we call them the tar tools because they're delivered in a tar archive, okay? So that's the differentiation will be clear in a moment when I tell you what the other tools options are for Linux. But this form factor here is available for all the supported guests. In recent years, we've offered a couple of new formats, and I know most of you you probably are running some Linux VMs in your vSphere environment, some probably more than others. Maybe 20% seems to be typical, depending on what your applications are. So we have a couple additional options for Linux guests. Now these are in addition to the ISO tools. So for Linux you have up to 3 different types of tools, but bear with me because it's not as bad as it sounds. So back in the day, when we first thought it might be better to have packages for operating systems, Linux operating systems, instead of asking our customers to run these tar installers, which often required that you had make install or even compilers sometimes. And a lot of customers just didn't want to have all that on production systems. So we said, okay, let's put together RPM or deb packages, and then you can just install them like you do anything else on your Linux machines, and that'll be good. So we started out doing that. We called those operating system specific packages. We actually host those ourselves, and we create those. VMware creates those. So then, more recently, we came up with a better idea, OpenVM Tools. So what we did is we open sourced the VMware Tools code, put it out on GitHub, not for customers to access directly. You can, but you don't need to. It's really for the distributions. So now Canonical, Red Hat, etc., they can go out there, get the code for VMware Tools. They can go through it, make any modifications they need to for their particular distros, package those up into their own binary RPMs or other packages, and put those in their own distribution channels, right alongside all the other packages that are part of those distributions. So that is really a benefit for you because you don't have to go and set up an additional repository or have multiple locations where you're pulling these packages from. And it's also easier for the distribution to support, because they created the packages. If you call them with a problem, they're definitely going to support you. VMware will also support you for those OpenVM tools. And just to be clear, we actually recommend the OpenVM tools that are part of Linux distributions over the tar tools for Linux. So even though we're still creating the tar tools, and you can still get them with every release of vSphere, we do want you to use the ones that come with your distribution if you have them. And the cutoff between those two different types of packages was about the RHEL 7 timeframe. So if you're on RHEL 6 and earlier, CentOS 6 and earlier, you're going to use OSPs, and then 7 and later, you'll be on the OVTs. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more about where these things come from. The ISO tools are easy. They're part of ESXi usually, so they're available when you do a fresh install, and also they're often released as ESXi patches. So there will be a VIB called tools-lite, and you can install that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. You can also download them. As of Tools 10, we decided to decouple those a little bit. And again, we'll talk about those in more detail later. The tools, these ISO tools, they can live on the local storage of your ESX servers. That's pretty much the default. But if you want to do it a different way, I'm going to tell you how you can put it on shared data store and just make it a little bit easier to manage that way. The OSPs, they come from a repository named packages.vmware.com. And if you go to that URL, you'll find all these different directories and things you can sort through. And you can find instructions on how to set up repositories for your particular Linux distribution. And the OVTs, as I mentioned earlier, there's no additional setup or anything needed. Those come directly from your Red Hat or your CentOS or your Ubuntu repositories. They're part of it. And depending on how you install those operating systems, you can most likely install OpenVM tools as part of your initial deployment. So if you're doing a scripted kickstart install or whatever, just add that package in there and it'll be ready to go when your VM comes up. And when it comes to installation, the original ISO tools, usually you mount the ISO to your VM, go in, run the installation routine. It's sort of done interactively, and it's done infrequently, especially for Windows. And I'm sure everybody here has gone through this process of sort of struggling with the mouse to get it to go in the right spot. Oh, you finally get the drivers going. But once you do, that becomes your gold master VM, and you make clones from there. And in fact, you have to have VMware Tools installed in that template in order to do customization. It's just a dependency there. So I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with this. And then for updating, there's a bunch of different ways to update, especially Windows tools, but all the tools really. And we'll go over all these methods in detail, so I don't need to name them out right now. If you're using the Linux package tools, then you're going to use the native package manager of your distribution. So yum or apt or whatever it is, and just do that all at once. Now, one more nice thing about Linux. Over the years, VMware has been working very hard to get all of our para-virtualized drivers into the upstream Linux kernel source. And so that has paid off. By now, all the important drivers, PVSCSI, VMXNet3, the Balloon driver, and a few others are part of the kernel. So any recent Linux distribution is going to have those drivers present. And this is one of the reasons why, you probably know this, but Linux VMs don't always need to be rebooted after you update VMware Tools. It's because you really didn't change any drivers. You just, you installed some additional helper applications into the VM. But the drivers are part of the kernel. And if you ever want to know or double check which drivers are present on your system, you can tell by running the command on the screen there, modinfo, and then the name of the driver. And if you see the -K at the end of the version number, that means this came from the upstream kernel source. It was not installed through tar tools or something like that. Now that's all fine and good for Linux, but what about Windows? Well, it's not really feasible for us to contribute our driver code to Microsoft per se, but one thing that we are working on, and again this falls into the tech preview that I showed the disclaimer for earlier, our engineers are hard at work finding a way to get some of those Windows drivers into the Windows update stream. And so this way you'll be able to pull down maybe the PVSCSI, VMXNet 3, maybe some others, still working on it, directly from Windows Update. So when you're updating .NET and all those other things that you have to do every month, if there's a VMware driver update, you can do it at the same time. Now that's convenient, but it's also beneficial because you may be able to avoid an additional reboot if you can combine these all together with other driver updates that you have to do anyways. So this is something that I'm really happy to see VMware working on, and I hope that it will eventually bear fruit and be available for you customers to take advantage of. Now let's shift gears and talk about the VMware Tools status in vSphere. And I'm sure everybody's looked at vSphere, and if you look at the VMware Tools status, you see all these confusing numbers. There's this 10-digit number that can't possibly be a version number. There's all these different statuses about being current or an upgrade's available. So what exactly does all this mean? Well, let's go back to our original layout here and talk about the ISO tools first. If you install tools through the official vSphere ISO tools, you're going to get a little bit additional information in vSphere. We're going to tell you which version of tools is running in there. And we're also going to tell you if there's an upgrade available. And I'll talk about what upgrade available means in a moment. But if you're running one of the guest managed tools, the package tools, up until recently, we did not work very hard to tell you exactly what version of tools were running in that guest. So we put a little bit of extra work on you as the customer to say, well, if you want to know, you got to go into the guest because these are guest managed tools. That number, that really long number that starts with 214, that's just the largest possible number that we could represent in there. And it's really just a placeholder. It's just a signal to say we are not telling you the version number, okay? So you have to have some other management technique to get in there and get the version number. And so we recognized that that was suboptimal. And so in vSphere 6.5, this is an enhancement, we'll now tell you much more useful information about all the tools that are installed in your VMs. So as long as you're on a version of VMware Tools 10 or later, 10.0 or later, and vSphere 6.5, you look in the web client and we'll tell you what type of tools are in there. Are they the tar tools? Are they package tools? OpenVM tools? And we'll tell you the version code, and we'll also tell you the more human-friendly version number. And that's for all the tools, Windows tools, etc. And so you don't have to look up that version code that we have been using in the past. So there's just a little bit more visibility there for you. Now, going back to the concept of upgrade available. You know, the status of tools is relative to the host on which the VM is running. So just to be clear, the VMs or vSphere, they don't call into the mothership and ask if there's an update available. The only update that is checked is whatever is present on that ESX server. So if you haven't patched your ESX host in a while, you might have a relatively old version of tools there. And if that's what version is in your VM, everything's fine, even though there's a much later version available. Now, there may come a day when you start patching your cluster and you get a new version of ESX and you've installed the patch there. A VM migrates over there. That's when the VM is going to check with the host and see if there's an update available. It's going to compare the running tools version with the version available on the host. And that's when you're going to get the notification that the tools can be updated. Okay? So it's as simple as that, really. So then you do the update, and now you're current. And of course, you're still backwards compatible. I'm sure everyone realizes that. So you can get on a later version of tools and still vMotion back to the old one. Now, the thing here is this version update, this detection only occurs when there's a power operation. So you either have to reboot your VM or you do a vMotion. That would count too. And so if you just updated the tools on a host, the VM will not instantly recognize that there's an update available. At least that's the way it was up until vSphere 6.5. As of 6.5, we've added a polling mechanism. So now it's no longer necessary to have a power operation for a VM to determine if there's an update. And so you can see on the screen here what's happening. It may not be very clear, but this VM it remains on the same host the entire time, this 2505 host. And what's happening is I'm updating the tools-lite vib under the covers here, and then within a few minutes it detects that and it displays the message that an update's available. And I'm going to tell you about an advanced configuration option that you can use to tune this interval. I'm not suggesting that you change it, but I just want to make you aware of it. By default, it's set for 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes, we're going to go in and see if there's an update available for tools. Not really recommended, and I think it even says on there, don't change this, continue only if you know what you're doing. So this would be something, if GSS is working with you and they determine that there's some good reason to make that change in your environment, okay? All right, now let's jump over to some of the more recent changes in the life cycle of VMware Tools. You probably remember this announcement a little while back, about a year and a half ago maybe at this point. We announced VMware Tools 10, and along with that we made a big deal that VMware Tools 10 was going to be released asynchronously. It will be separate from vSphere. And the benefit to that is we're going to treat it more like a full-fledged software release. We're going to have release notes with every release of tools. We're going to tell you exactly what's fixed in there, what the known issues are, and we're going to tell you things like what are the driver versions of every little component in there. We're trying to really give you a lot more visibility into tools. But this did cause a little bit of panic. People started wondering, oh wait, does that mean you're not going to ship tools with vSphere anymore? Because I really want you to do that. And yeah, we are still going to ship tools with vSphere, just like we have been. We're just giving this additional release mechanism so that we can release more often and not be tied to ESX releases or ESX patches. So that's one reason. There's another reason we'll get into in a second. And just as a reminder, if you ever want to know how to get the tools, might not be that intuitive, just log into My VMware, and if you can find that Drivers and Tools tab, click on that, and you'll usually see tools. And sometimes there are several versions listed, so you might want to grab the latest one in general. And then just as a shortcut, I try to keep this updated, this shortcut URL, vmware.com/go/tools will take you right to the latest version. Now, another interesting thing happened with the release of Tools 10.1. This was last year. We made a decision on how to handle some of our legacy guest operating systems. These are operating systems that are no longer supported by the vendors. So we're talking about like Windows XP, Windows Server 2003, really old versions of Linux. There are a lot of customers, maybe some of you in the room here, have an application that only runs on those older versions, and you need to keep running that for a while. You need more time. And so what we decided to do is create one more release of tools that will support those older versions. And you got to understand, it's hard for us to get those drivers signed by those vendors because they don't even support those operating systems anymore. So we did this. We call that Tools 10.0.12. And that's the end of the line for the 10.0 branch. And this is the highest version of tools that you'll ever be able to run in those legacy guest OSs. Okay? All the new development, new features, enhancements, and et cetera, are going to go into the 10.1 branch and later, of course. That's going to keep incrementing over time. And so it's a little confusing at first, but I think once you understand it, it starts to make sense. We bundle Tools 10.0.12 and 10.1 with the current release of ESX. But you don't need both of those. It just depends on which guest operating system you're going to be running. Now there's a whole other collection of tools also broken out into the 10.1 plus or 10.0.12 frozen line. And these are for the less popular guest operating systems. Some of you, maybe in education, have a large Mac environment with Mac hardware, and you're allowed to, Apple hardware, you're allowed to run Mac VMs In that case, you might want to use the Mac tools. So you'll have to download those from My VMware. They don't come as part of ESXi anymore. Okay? And then, same thing for the frozen, the old NetWare tools, etc. Those are available for download from My VMware. So that's the difference. Now, in order to accommodate that change where older versions of Windows use a certain version of tools, newer ones use a different version, same thing for Linux. I'm showing Red Hat on the screen here. We made a change in how the tools are detected according to the guest operating system. And a part of that is this new manifest file that's delivered with the tools. And this is just a mapping between the guest operating system type and the tools ISO that you need in order to install the proper version of tools. So you can see the older version of RHEL, it uses the old frozen called Linux pre-glibc 2.5 ISO. So that's a change in vSphere. And so in order to support that change, we had to modify vSphere. And to get a change in vSphere, you have to have a patch. So about a year ago, we released a patch for ESX5.5 as well as 6.0 that have introduced the logic to detecting the proper version of tools. Now, I was working with a customer who was trying to upgrade a large number of VMs, and he did have a bunch of legacy OSs present, and he was having a heck of a time because he wasn't always getting the right ISO image on some of those older ones, and they were giving him errors when he was trying to install. And we found out that he wasn't up to date or recently up to date on the patches, and so he had to do that. And once he applied these patches, then everything started working properly. And I want to just point out a nice little quick reference card that if you don't know about it, you can go to this version mapping file. It's maintained online. It happens to live on that packages.vmware.com site. This is where you can go to find out essentially all the releases of VMware Tools, which version of vSphere they would have shipped with, if any. If you see ESXi 0/0, that means that particular version of tools never shipped with vSphere yet. If it ends up getting shipped with a future patch of vSphere, then we'll go back and update this file. This is just a handy reference so you can keep track of your build numbers for tools and build numbers for ESX, just to make sure that you're on the version that you think you should be on. And then backwards and forwards compatibility is really pretty great with tools. You don't have to be on the latest version of tools. You don't have to worry about running an older version of tools if you're still on an older version of ESXi. It's really up to you. Whatever's convenient in your environment, minding any security vulnerabilities that may have been addressed, you're pretty good to go on any recent version of tools. It's always a good idea to jump to the latest version if you are doing an update. But we last year reached end of support for some versions of ESXi. So you probably know that 5.0 and 5.1 are no longer supported. And so the versions of tools that we shipped out with those versions of ESX are no longer supported. And that's how we're handling that. You can upgrade those VMs to 10.1 or 10.0.12. But at this point, we don't want you to upgrade to the very latest from those old unsupported versions. And this is really just a testing matrix problem, right? We don't go back and test all these old versions with all of the future versions. So unfortunately, if you're still on a really old release of tools, I hope it doesn't apply to too many people at this point, but if you are, you're going to need to go to a two-step update to get on 10.1 and then 10.1.7 or whatever you want to be on the latest, okay? Now let's look at a couple approaches that you can use to standardize the tools version across your entire vSphere infrastructure. One easy way to do that is to just put your VMware Tools on a shared data store. You don't need to create a new data store just for this. You can use any data store that's already presented to your cluster. Create a folder there, call it whatever you want, copy your VMware Tools ISO images over there. Either you get them right off of one of your hosts, or you can download the latest ones off of My VMware. Either way, doesn't matter. Then you'll make a quick configuration change. I'll go through this in more detail in a second. And essentially what this is going to do is update a symlink on the ESXi console. If you've ever SSH'd into your ESXi machine, you may have seen a symlink in the root called product locker. That is pointing to the location of the tools installer. Okay, so this is derived from an advanced configuration option on ESX. Wherever that's pointing is where ESX is going to look for tools. The nice thing about this is you change tools in one place, boom, you now have a new version of tools presented to all the hosts in your cluster. Okay? So let's go through this in a little bit more detail. So it's really just 3 steps. First step is obtain the tools that you want to standardize on and put them on some shared folder. Your choice. You name it whatever you want and just unzip everything in there. You can include all the tools or just the ones that you know you're going to be using in your environment. Okay, step 2 is you have to set this advanced configuration setting to point to that location that you just created. And this can be done through PowerCLI, very handy. You can do the whole cluster in one command. Or you can do it in host profiles if you like. If you're using auto deploy, that's actually the way you would have to do it. So once that's done, in order for it to take effect, you have to reboot your machine, unfortunately. And I know you don't like rebooting, so maybe you could coordinate this with another patching that you're going to do anyway. Or if you like, you can jump in and make this take effect immediately. But for those of you that are familiar with this, because this option's been around for quite a long time, there's something different in 6.5 that you need to be aware of. And the host really does need to be in maintenance mode when you manually update the symlink. So if you see the commands I have on the screen there, you're going to delete this symlink and create a new one, right? It's just a couple shell commands. You can automate it if you want somehow, if you have a way to log into all your machines over SSH. But you got to make sure that the host is in maintenance mode. Because if a VM happens to be accessing that at the moment that you mess with it, we've seen some bad things happen, crash the VM or worse. So, like any other big change on ESX, you want to be in maintenance mode, especially if this is a production environment. Okay, and so once you do that, you might want to consider using the No Tools ESXi image profile. And especially if you're on auto deploy, this is a no-brainer. You don't want all those tools images being pulled across the network every time you boot a host because you're not even going to use them. But even if you're not using auto deploy, you can still create an image based on this image profile. If you're creating an ISO using the PowerCLI commandlets or whatever. So it's just a good thing to do to optimize. If you don't do this, there's no harm done. You'll just have an extra copy of the VMware Tools installer on every host in your environment that will never get used. It's not the end of the world. And if you're using local disk, it's just going to take up just a few megabytes extra. It's not a big deal, but it's up to you. Now, I wanted to talk about another standardization approach that may be easier or more preferred for you. So this one is for environments that are not using auto deploy. This is for any environment really. If you're using VUM to patch your hosts, one of the reasons why you get all those VMware Tools updates is available message on all your VMs is because if you're just applying all the patches that VMware delivers for ESXi, you're going to get those the tools patch too. And it's going to be delivered out to all your hosts, and then over time the VMs are going to detect that there are new tools available, and they're going to say, oh, tools update is available. So what you can do is you can create your VUM baselines to patch your host like you normally do, but use the option in there to exclude the tools-lite vib. This is, maybe you don't use the exclusion option in the baseline, but it's right there in the wizard when you walk through it. And you can see I have the last page right here. So just exclude it. This way you can patch your hosts, get all the critical security patches on your hosts as needed, but you'll never have a tools vib slipping in without being intentional. And so I thought, well, maybe I could just give a quick demo of how to take advantage of this particular use case. So I have a situation here. I've got a VM. It's running, let's see, tools 10.1. And I got a security bulletin from VMware. It says, okay, this bulletin's available. This patches tools-lite. That'll bring me up to the latest version of tools. That sounds good. So I'm going to go ahead and use PowerCLI to see if I can script this up. So first I'll make sure that patch is in my repository, and it is. That's great because Vum checks in regularly to download those. And I'm just going to whip up a few lines of PowerCLI here to specify the patch. I'm going to create a new baseline. And this would be handy, you know, if we're going to want to use this baseline on lots of clusters in a data center or even across multiple vCenter environments. If you have to, you could, you know, work this into some kind of script. So we create the baseline, and then we're going to get the cluster and attach the baseline to the cluster. And you know, it's similar to how you go through the wizard to do this in Vum. You have to do certain things when you're doing remediation, disabling HA, for example. And so if you want to do these Vum operations through the PowerCLI, we're going to have to do that as well. So we'll go ahead and do the update, and we'll disable high availability, say yes, and we're just going to do one host just as a test. We'll jump back over to vSphere, and we'll see the jobs have kicked off and they're running. And this VM is on this host, the same host, this whole time. And sure enough, it detected that there's a new tools available because this is vSphere 6.5, and we have that polling feature enabled. So now we're going to go in, do a regular old vanilla tools update right through the web client. And, you know, in a matter of a minute or so, we are up to date, and we can check, and we're on the latest version of tools. So now you can just kind of repeat that process, stamp it out across the rest of your infrastructure. And one thing you might notice here is this VM actually didn't reboot. And that happens once in a while. You might get lucky. If you didn't change a driver that was in use by the operating system, there's no reason to reboot. And Tools tries to be smart about it, but reality is most of the time you're using PV-SCSI, VMXNet3, all those things. They're in use. We're going to try to replace them, and those are the conditions we have to live by. You know, the operating system requires a reboot. So your best bet is to try to combine those reboots with other reboots from other patching operations, but that's where we are today. So let's jump back over here. Okay, great. Now we're going to walk through all the different ways you can consider using in your data center to update VMware Tools. And you might want to ask yourself, oh, why are there so many ways? Shouldn't there just be like one or two ways? Well, yeah, but you'll see. There's different reasons, right? Maybe you want to optimize for simplification, make it really easy. Or maybe you want to delegate that to the application owner, or you want to have more control. So it's really up to you. That's why we offer so many ways. So let's talk about the easiest and simplest thing to do. Probably everybody knows about this. You can have tools update automatically when a VM boots. You just check a box in the VM configuration, and next time that VM reboots for any reason, it's going to try to see if there's a tools update that can be installed. Now, I would really only recommend this for less critical workloads. So, you know, for example, you don't want to put this on your SQL Server databases. Your DBAs are not going to be happy with you. They spend a lot of time to get the database all shut down. They can do some patching. They reboot their database VM. It comes back up. They're watching it very closely to make sure everything's okay. And then tools installer kicks off and triggers another reboot after that. And you're definitely going to not make friends if you use that on critical applications. But it probably makes a lot of sense in lab environments, development environments, where you just want to make sure that things are reasonably up to date. You know, so just keep that in mind. Now, there's another way to check those boxes. You don't have to go around to every single VM, edit the configuration one by one. If you have Update Manager available, you can actually do, this is one of the things Update Manager allows you to do, is use the interface there to check all the boxes at once, if you want to do that, or multiple. All right, so the second way you can update tools is through the web client. I just showed that. And you can actually multi-select VMs if you didn't know that. So you can do 10 at a time if that's easier for you. And you can read about it on the KB articles, but we've got some switches you can supply in that box if you've never seen that before. And what this can do is you can delay the reboot. The reboot is still going to be required for the new drivers to take effect, right? But let's say you want to postpone the reboot. You want to do the tools update, reboot some other time when it's more convenient. You can supply some parameters there in the advanced options. All right, then we have Update Manager. And we just showed you one aspect of Update Manager in that demo, and that is Update Manager pushes that tool's light vib out to all your ESXi hosts. But it also has a completely different task that it can perform when it comes to VMware Tools, and that is to actually update the tools. So you can use Update Manager, and this is different from what I just talked about, where Update Manager was used to toggle that flag of update on boot. This is different. This is go update the tools in the VM right now or on a schedule. And this is nice. It's a lot of customers like this. And one thing that this can do that other methods can't is it can actually do powered off or suspended VMs, which is handy, right? So if you have some template VMs or something, you can have Update Manager temporarily power them on, patch the tools, power it back off, leave it how it found it. So this is a pretty nice way to go, and a lot of customers find some value there. Pointing out a couple new things we did in 6.5 that are related to Update Manager. One is virtual hardware. If you've ever tried to update the virtual hardware using Update Manager for VMs that are running the Linux packaged tools, so OVTs or OSPs, prior to 6.5, Update Manager would refuse to do that. So going forward, we've relaxed that restriction, and so you can now update the hardware compatibility level or VM hardware, depending on what you want to call it, using Update Manager. And then we've also, we're a little bit smarter about rebooting Linux tools, Linux VMs after installing the tar tools with Update Manager. So just to be clear, if you use Update Manager to update tools on a Linux VM, you're dealing with the tar tools that come in the ISO image, not the package tools. The package tools, OVTs, OSPs, have to be updated through the guest package manager, which means you have to have root access to the VM to run that command. So there's two different ways of getting into the VM to update tools when it comes to Linux. This is referring to the ISO tools. We're cutting down on the reboots that are not necessary. All right, PowerCLI, everybody loves PowerCLI. This is a really great option for updating lots of tools in your environment. You can just use your imagination and find all kinds of ways to filter out and list virtual machines based on cluster, based on current guest operating system, current tools version, all kinds of things in there you can do. And this just kicks off the tools update job in vSphere. vSphere is still, of course, doing the updating, but PowerCLI is telling it to do it. This is a really good way to go if you have large environments. I strongly recommend looking into this. And then finally, let's say you are in a situation where your application owners really want to own every aspect of what is happening inside the VM. And I know this is the case a lot of times. They really don't want to give you any maintenance windows to do reboots, to install any software or anything like that. And so in this case, you can actually delegate that authority if you're comfortable with that. I guess the trade-off would be these tools might get out of date, right? Because if you're no longer dictating what version needs to run out there, it'll be up to the application owner. But you can do that, and you can instruct them how to update the tools right through the toolbar tray icon there. And of course, the package managers are used to update the Linux package tools. That's, we've mentioned a few times, but just to make it clear, you install or update through Yum, through app. Now, I want to tell you about something new. And it's not yet available, but we're just putting the finishing touches on it. For those customers that are using System Center to manage Windows machines, we've heard that there's some interest in being able to deploy tools through SCCM. And so we're putting the finishing touches on a new white paper. It should be available shortly, and it'll go through the steps on everything you need to do if you want to update or deploy tools through that mechanism. And of course, the advantage to doing it that way, if you're already using it, it wouldn't be worthwhile to set up SCCM just to do this, because there's a lot of overhead here. But if you're already doing it, it makes sense, because now you can combine other patching operations with your tools updates. So just something else to keep in mind in that environment. And so, that sort of brings us to the end of our session today. I hope that you understood why we have so many different ways of updating tools. It gives you the flexibility there. I hope that you can understand why we have the different types of Linux tools and what the trade-offs are and why you might want to use the package tools versus the ISO tools. And again, we do recommend that you use the package tools. The OVTs that are shipped with your distribution are the way to go. You may run into some edge case where it doesn't work for you. If that happens, you should let VMware know. You should open a ticket with GSS so that we can work this out, because we really want OVT to have parity with the TAR tools, and we think that there is. But if you find a reason that there isn't, you should let us know. Okay, and then we also covered the changes in Tools 10 with the 10.0.12 and the frozen tools. Hopefully that'll be well understood for those of you with legacy VMs. And if you want to get more information, I cover a lot of the things that I talked about in this session in more detail on the official vSphere blog. You can head over there, search for tools. You'll find some articles I've written going into more depth on a lot of these topics. Please remember to fill out your survey. This is actually the first year that we've done the tools session in Europe. We did it for the first time last year, US only, and we had really good feedback. So if you like this and you want to see it again, let us know through the survey. That would be helpful. That's all I have right now. Thank you very much for coming, and I'll be happy to take any questions up here at the front for the rest of the time. Thank you very much.